Our prices are insane. That was the promise Eddie Antar made to millions of American consumers every single time his face appeared on television. And he meant it. Just not in the way anyone watching actually understood. What Eddie Antar built was not simply a discount electronics chain. It was a machine. A beautifully designed, publicly traded, nationally recognized machine for moving money from investors, from the government, and eventually from the company itself into the private hands of one extended family. And they did it for nearly 2 decades while smiling into cameras and cutting ribbon after ribbon at grand opening after grand opening. To understand how this fraud worked, you have to start at the beginning. Not with the crime, but with the genuine hustle that came before it. Eddie Antar grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in a Lebanese Jewish immigrant family with deep roots in the retail trade. His grandfather sold goods from a pushcart. His father ran a small appliance store. Eddie absorbed the merchant mentality from childhood, and by 1969, when he was just 19 years old, he opened his own store in Brooklyn with his father Sam. They called it Sights and Sounds. It was small, scrappy, and priced aggressively. The model was simple. Buy in high volume, cut margins, move product fast, repeat. The store worked. Customers responded to the low prices and the chaotic energy of the sales floor. By the mid-1970s, Eddie had rebranded the operation with a name that would become one of the most recognized in American retail. Crazy Eddie. The concept was pure theater. Not just low prices, but an experience. A performance of discount retail so energetic and so relentless that consumers felt they were witnessing something almost illegal. Prices this low could not possibly be legitimate. And that, of course, was the joke embedded in the entire enterprise. They were not. The television commercials that ran throughout the New York metro area in the late 1970s and early 1980s featured a man named Jerry Carroll, a local disc jockey who would careen across the screen in a frenzy, arms waving, voice cracking, shouting about prices so low they were insane. The ads were inescapable. They became cultural touchstones. Saturday Night Live referenced them. Comedians did impressions. Crazy Eddie became shorthand for a kind of joyful, unhinged deal-seeking that resonated with middle-class American consumers watching their budgets carefully during an inflationary decade. Meanwhile, in the back offices, something else entirely was being built. From the very beginning of the operation, Eddie Antar ran what investigators would later call a skimming operation. Cash that came into the stores did not all find its way onto the books. A portion was quietly removed before it was ever recorded. This was not an accident or a minor bookkeeping irregularity. It was systematic. It was organized. And it was a family affair. The Antar family, including Eddie's father, his cousins, and various relatives brought into the business at every level, participated in siphoning cash out of the retail operation before it could be taxed. The money moved in a variety of ways. Some of it was carried out physically in bags. Some of it was deposited into accounts in Israel, where Eddie maintained financial holdings outside the reach of American tax authorities. Estimates of the total amount skimmed during this period range into the tens of millions of dollars. This was the first phase of the fraud. And by itself, it was significant. But it became something far larger because of what Eddie decided to do in 1984. He decided to take Crazy Eddie public. Think carefully about what this decision meant from a purely mechanical standpoint. If you have been secretly removing cash from a business for 15 years, your reported income is artificially low. Your profit margins on paper look thin. Your company, as a financial entity, appears much smaller than it actually is. Now you want to sell shares of that company to the public. Investors will pay a multiple of your earnings. The more earnings you show, the more money you raise. What Eddie Antar and his family did was reverse the skimming operation in the most audacious way possible. In the years leading up to the IPO, they began pushing money back into the company. Cash that had been held offshore and in private accounts started flowing back into Crazy Eddie's reported financials. The effect on the numbers was dramatic. Revenue appeared to surge. Profits looked extraordinary. Growth looked explosive. Analysts were impressed. Investors were enthusiastic. The company went public in 1984 and the stock climbed steadily. Eddie Antar became wealthy on paper in a way that was visible and documented and celebrated. Business publications wrote about him. The expansion of Crazy Eddie from a regional New York phenomenon into a multi-state chain was treated as a retail success story. But the numbers were not real. After the IPO, once the Antars had sold their shares at inflated prices, the scheme shifted again. Now the goal was not to inflate earnings but to loot whatever remained. Inventory was manipulated. Goods were recorded as existing in warehouses when they did not. Accounts payable were understated. Accounts receivable were inflated. The team responsible for managing the books, again primarily family members, systematically altered financial records to maintain the illusion that Crazy Eddie was a growing, profitable enterprise. The mechanics of the inventory fraud are worth examining closely because they reveal how sophisticated this operation had become. During audit periods, Crazy Eddie employees would physically move merchandise between store locations to make inventory counts appear higher than they were. Shipping containers were listed as containing goods that were never actually received. Purchase documents were forged. At one point, auditors reviewing the company's records were shown inventory that simply did not exist. The numbers on paper bore almost no relationship to the physical reality of what was on shelves and in warehouses. At the peak of this second phase, the gap between what Crazy Eddie reported and what was actually there reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The stock price held. Investors kept buying. And the family kept selling their shares at prices that reflected a company that existed only on paper. The unraveling began in 1987 and it was not triggered by a regulator or an auditor. It was triggered by a divorce. Eddie Antar's ex-wife, Deborah, became part of a legal dispute that led to financial scrutiny of the family's holdings. The personal financial conflict created an opening that investigators were eventually able to exploit. Around the same time, a new team of auditors conducting a more rigorous review of the company's books began finding inconsistencies that earlier reviews had missed or overlooked. Crazy Eddie was taken over by outside investors in 1987, and when those investors gained access to the actual books, the picture that emerged was staggering. Inventory was overstated by more than $65 million. The accounts were riddled with fabrications. The company that investors had been told was a thriving growth story was in fact deeply insolvent, propped up by years of systematic misrepresentation. The stores began closing. The brand that had dominated New York airwaves for nearly 2 decades evaporated almost overnight. And Eddie Antar disappeared. This is where the story takes on an almost cinematic quality. Eddie Antar fled the United States before charges were formally filed against him. Using a combination of financial resources he had managed to keep hidden and a network of contacts that extended internationally, he relocated to Israel. He lived there under the name David Cohen. He was not in hiding exactly. He was simply absent, operating under the assumption that geography would provide him the same protection it had provided his offshore money. He was wrong. In 1992, after years of coordination between American prosecutors and Israeli authorities, Eddie Antar was located in Israel and extradited back to the United States to face charges. The legal process that followed was long and complicated, involving multiple trials, appeals, and procedural disputes. At various points, convictions were overturned and then reinstated. Eddie Antar ultimately served a significant prison sentence, though the exact duration was shaped by the legal battles that surrounded his case throughout the 1990s. The key figure who helped break the case open from the inside was Sam Antar, Eddie's cousin, who had served as the chief financial officer of Crazy Eddie during the fraud years. Sam Antar cooperated with federal investigators and became one of the most detailed and candid witnesses in the entire case. He has since spent years speaking publicly about the mechanics of the fraud, describing not just what was done but how it was justified internally and how it was designed to evade detection. Sam Antar's cooperation is what transformed this from a story about a colorful retail implosion into a documented case study in how fraud actually operates at scale. Because the details he provided were not abstract. They were specific, granular, They showed investigators and eventually the public exactly where the money went and how the manipulation was sustained across multiple audit cycles with multiple accounting firms involved. The total losses attributed to the Crazy Eddie fraud, including the damage to investors who purchased shares based on fraudulent financials, have been estimated at more than $140 million. The IRS separately pursued tax claims related to the years of skimming that preceded the public offering. The full financial picture, including what was removed before the IPO and what was looted afterward, represents one of the most complete examples of retail fraud in American business history. What makes this case so instructive from a financial analysis perspective is the structure of the deception across time. The fraud did not begin with the IPO. It began with skimming. The skimming created a pool of hidden resources. Those resources were then used to inflate the company before going public. The public offering generated new capital and a liquid market for insider shares. And then the final phase extracted whatever remained from investors who had no idea what they were holding. Each phase of the scheme was designed to exploit a different vulnerability. Tax authorities were defrauded first. Then capital markets. Then the investors who trusted those markets. The Crazy Eddie brand itself, built on the premise of radical honesty about prices, was the most effective cover imaginable. The louder you shout about how good the deal is, the less anyone thinks to question whether you are telling the truth. Eddie Antar died in 2016. He never fully acknowledged the scope of what he had done. The brand he created has largely faded from memory for anyone under 40, surviving mainly as a reference point in business school fraud discussions and the occasional documentary. But the structure he built, the family network, the layered deception, the exploitation of order to trust, the use of theatrical public persona as camouflage for systematic theft, that structure did not disappear. It just found new stages to perform on. If you want the full story and more dark business secrets, find us on YouTube at Corporate Crypt. The link is in the description. Subscribe so you never miss a story. And if you want to create content like this yourself, check out the AI tools in the description below.